So just because the iPhone 14 has lower sales numbers than the iPhone 13 does not make it a bad phone. Now, contrary to popular belief, it is a decent phone with a decent price, but how does it compare to the Galaxy S23? Now, if there's one thing and only one thing I do today is to give you guys a clear recommendation on which phone to get and why. So let's go. Now let's start things off with the S23. Now just like the S22 Ultra from last year, the S23 now has the same floating camera design. This gives all three devices a more uniform look. However, I still kind of prefer the design of the S22. Now even though the design is somewhat boring now in my opinion, the physical aspect of the S23 is still top tier and what appeals to me the most. It is 6.1 inches tall with Gorilla Glass Victus 2 at the front and at the back, which makes it hard for it to break or have any significant scratches. Now even though these phones are tough as hell, you should get a protective case on it just to be on the safe side. Now the back of the phone is where the build quality shines the most. It has a smooth matte finish in lavender that complements the aluminum rails all around the phone. Now the right side holds the power button and the volume button, and with the shape and the height you can distinguish both of them in the dark with ease. Now at the bottom you have a USB-C port that is standard and with stereo speakers, which are kind of the same from last year. Whereas for the iPhone 14, Apple really didn't change much. It still has the same square design that is 6.1 inches tall on par with the S23. However, there are two main differences with its design. Now for one, the S23 has a soft matte finish while the iPhone 14 has the glass back and attracts a lot of smudges and fingerprint marks. And number two, the camera designs are very distinctive, making sure you never mix these phones up in any case. Now even though both phones are identical in height and build quality, the S23 is lighter with 168 grams while the iPhone 14 is 172 grams. Now unlike the S23 though, the iPhone 14 has a volume button on the left side, a lightning cable at the bottom, and stereo speakers that are really on par with each other. So with a matte finish, the vertical camera bar, and how lightweight the phone can get, the S23 will win this round with a better design. Now moving on to the display, the S23 is a 1080p AMOLED 2X with a smooth 120Hz display. All sides are symmetrical with a single hole point camera in the center that utilizes its screen real estate. Now the 1080p might disappoint some, it definitely disappointed me, but when compared with other high-end phones, you can't really tell the difference. And for that retail price, I think Samsung did really well with its display. There is also a huge upgrade with its brightness. The S23 now has a max brightness of 1750 nits, which is a lot brighter than a lot of flagships in that price range. Now I have no issues when navigating my phone outside, but if by any chance you can navigate your phone at all, which I highly doubt, the S23 has a vision booster to help enhance your experience. But the majority of the time you might not really need that much brightness. On the iPhone 14, its display is second best to the S23 for many reasons. For one, it still has the ugly notch at the top, a design that Apple themselves have done away with the iPhone 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max, making this no different than the iPhone 13, the iPhone 12, or even the iPhone 11. Honestly, I can go on and on. Secondly, the iPhone 14 still has a 60Hz display. And I'm not that guy that says higher refresh rate is a deal breaker, but when your phone costs $799, those features are expected. Look, Apple, I ain't gonna hold you, but you have to give us something with the iPhone 15, even if it's a 90Hz display. Third, there is no always on display. Again, this is a feature that is on the iPhone 14 Pro and the Pro Max and neglected on the iPhone 14. Now, even though the always on display is different than Android phones, it is something that should be mandatory on all models. And finally, the iPhone 14 has less peak brightness than the S23 with 1200 nits. Now, when it comes to unlocking these phones, they are very much the same, but they're different. The iPhone uses the standard Face ID, which is fast and honestly one of the easiest ways to unlock your phone, whereas the S23 does have some sort of face unlock, but it's not on par with the iPhone. So I suggest most people just use the ultrasonic fingerprint reader instead. Now that I really think about it, this kind of sounded like a rant. Well, I don't know, maybe it is. But if it isn't clear by now, the S23 has the better display by a huge landslide. Let's talk about the battery life. Now the S23 battery capacity has improved this year. It is now 3,900 mAh from last year's 3,700. Now when I first reviewed this phone about 2 months ago, I said the battery was not S22 bad and it wasn't great either. And that's not the case after a few months. The adaptive battery has set in and it has learned all my habits, and I can say I can leave my apartment and wouldn't worry about the battery till I get home, removing any bit of battery anxiety that I may have had. Battery optimization has improved with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip, but more on the software after this. Now, while on the iPhone, Apple wasn't lying when they said the iPhone 14 is their longest battery life ever. It is 3,279 million hours, and I think I can call this a 2-day battery phone, and if you just do calls and text, it may be even longer. Now, I'm not stupid. Many things enhance the battery, like a high refresh rate or the lack of an always-on display, but these trade-offs are, well, they're trade-offs. If you care about having a long-standing battery life, then the iPhone is what you should really buy. So with that being said, the iPhone 14 will take this round. Now, when it comes to software and performance, you get a different experience entirely. On the S23, you have One UI, which is great. It's not really my favorite skin on Android, but it has made improvements over the last couple of years. Now, performance on this hasn't dipped in any way possible. It's still very snappy since the first day I started using it, and if you play games, you will be satisfied. Now, one of the best things about One UI is its ability to be very customizable. I have a lock screen widget to see if I have any schedules or alarms, and I can design them to anything that I want. Now, if you're also into applying themes and not installing different launchers, Samsung has different themes that you can choose from, especially when changing icons if the stock icons are not really your taste. Now, I'm a very simple person when it comes to my home screen. I prefer a colorful wallpaper, 2 to 3 essential icons on the front, and I then color code my apps for easier access. On the iPhone 14, Apple decided to give us the same chip that was in the iPhone 13, and that is the A15 Bionic chip. Until this day, I'm not really sure what brought them to that decision. Was it the chip shortages, or they just wanted to keep the price down? Nevertheless, new phones should always have the newer specs. And because of Apple and their great marketing, almost everyone glossed over this. It's pretty crazy. Either way, the performance on the iPhone 14 is still pretty good with iOS 16. Its ability to customize your lock screen with different widgets and styles is pretty clean and is pretty decent. Now, this is Android versus iOS, and picking a winner for this one is very hard because I have a few things I love on the iPhone, like AirDrop and its overall ecosystem, but there are other things that I love on the S23, which is better, like customizations and whatnot. So because of that, I want to give this a fair tie. Finally, the most important category on this list, the cameras. Now, the cameras on both these phones differ a whole lot. Now, the S23 has the same specs as last year, which means we're arguably going to get the same camera quality with just faster processing, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It is a 50 megapixel wide-angle lens, a 10 megapixel telephoto lens with 30x zoom, and a 12 megapixel ultra-wide lens. Now, the 14 has a dual camera setup, which is a 12 megapixel wide-angle and a 12 megapixel ultra-wide, so it's also lacking that dedicated telephoto lens. Now, while in front, it has a single 12 megapixel selfie camera. Now, during the day, pictures from both these phones come out really well. It is great in terms of color and vibrancy, but I noticed the S23 pictures are a lot more saturated, and some may like this, and it always goes down to preference, but for me it looked a lot more artificial than natural. Now, the ultra wide on both the 14 and the S23 are pretty good, but I noticed much more detail and color balance on the iPhone 14, making it better for pictures. Now, where the S23 shines the most is with its telephoto lens and that 30x zoom, and compared with the iPhone 14, which does not have a dedicated telephoto lens, it only goes as far as 5x. Now, a silver lining though is with its video. The iPhone 14 shoots better video footage than the S23, and now with a cinematic mode that shoots in 4K in 30 and 20 frames per second, it is an extra edge. But don't get me wrong, the S23 shoots good video, especially in 8K, so it's not so far off as you may think. So with all that being said, this is no BS, the S23 is my recommendation to you guys. Now, while the iPhone 14 is great, it is essentially the iPhone 13 Pro, which is a better phone and will cost you less. Thank you guys for watching this video, and if you found any value from this at all, make sure you subscribe to the channel and like this video, as this goes a long way for me. Now, if you want to see my thoughts on the S23 after switching fully from the iPhone 14 Pro Max, you can click right here, and I'll see you guys there where we talk all things tech.